It was the spring of 1944, and Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein was doing something unusual for a senior Wehrmacht officer. He was reading. Not maps, not operational orders, not the daily situation reports that arrived by courier from Army Group B headquarters. He was reading American field manuals, captured copies that German intelligence had collected from overrun positions in North Africa and Italy, and passed along to commanders who were now preparing to defend the coast of France against an invasion everyone knew was coming. Bayerlein read them carefully. He had been Rommel's chief of staff in the desert and had learned from the best German tactical mind of the war to take his enemy seriously, to study him the way a craftsman studies the tools of a rival trade. The Americans wrote well. Their manuals were clear, logical, and precisely organized. Their doctrine for combined arms operations, for the coordination of infantry and armor and artillery and air support, was sophisticated in ways that surprised him. He annotated the margins. He discussed the material with his staff. He believed, as any serious professional would, that understanding how your enemy intended to fight was a prerequisite for defeating him. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra began. Approximately 2,500 American aircraft appeared over the target corridor west of Saint-Lô and dropped more than 4,000 tons of bombs on the area where Bayerlein's Panzerlehr division was dug in. His division had been built from the instructors at Germany's armor and motorized warfare schools. It was, by design, the closest thing the Wehrmacht could assemble to its own ideal of a German armored division. It ceased to exist as a coherent fighting formation within hours. Bayerlein wrote afterward that the long duration of the bombing, without any possibility for opposition, created a feeling of helplessness and inferiority that caused men who had fought across 3 continents to simply stop fighting. He had read every American manual he could find. He had understood intellectually what American combined arms doctrine was designed to achieve. What no manual had conveyed, because no manual could, was the experience of being on the receiving end of a system that had been industrialized. The difference between understanding a weapon and surviving it is the distance between a diagram and a fact. And for the men of Panzerlehr Division that July morning, the fact arrived at a rate of several tons per minute. The German misreading of American military power was not a failure of intelligence in the narrow sense. German intelligence services collected accurate data throughout the war. They knew American production figures, or close enough to them. They had access to captured equipment, captured documents, and the testimony of prisoners. They understood the theory of what America was building. What they consistently failed to do was believe it. The contempt that ran through German assessments of American military capability in the years before Pearl Harbor was not born from ignorance but from a kind of professional arrogance that the Wehrmacht's early successes had made almost impossible to dislodge. These were the men who had solved the problem of the Western Front in 6 weeks in 1940, a problem that had consumed 4 years and millions of lives in the previous war. They had developed Blitzkrieg not as a slogan but as a genuine operational method that combined armor and air and motorized infantry into a system of maneuver warfare that paralyzed enemies faster than those enemies could process what was happening to them. They had done this against professional armies with long traditions, against the British and the French who had studied war since Napoleon. If the British and French could be defeated so comprehensively, what realistic threat could a nation of automobile salesmen and jazz musicians pose? Hermann Göring, whose Luftwaffe had been the cutting edge of German operational success, dismissed American industrial claims as fantasy. When Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that the United States would produce 50,000 aircraft per year, Göring told his staff the number was impossible, a propaganda figure designed to intimidate rather than inform. In 1939, American military aircraft production had been fewer than 3,000 planes. A 17-fold increase was not a production target. It was a fairy tale. He was wrong by a factor of nearly 2. American factories produced approximately 96,000 military aircraft in 1944 alone. The Luftwaffe produced roughly 39,000 in its peak year. The gap that Göring had dismissed as impossible became the central fact of the air war over Europe, and it showed up every morning when German pilots climbed into their cockpits and looked at the odds they were flying against. Hitler shared this contempt and expressed it with his characteristic certainty. In January 1942, weeks after Pearl Harbor, he told his inner circle that America was a decayed country, weakened by its racial contradictions and its democratic softness, incapable of sustaining the kind of national sacrifice that modern war demanded. He had watched the American performance in the First World War, where it had taken the United States nearly 2 years after entering the conflict to put an effective fighting force in the field, and he concluded from this that American mobilization was inherently slow, bureaucratic, and limited by a culture that did not value military virtues. He was not entirely wrong about the pace of the First World War mobilization. He was entirely wrong about what that pace implied for the Second. The catastrophe at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 appeared to confirm every German assumption. Rommel's forces tore through American positions in Tunisia with a speed and violence that shocked even experienced observers. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded the American Second Corps from an elaborate underground bunker approximately 70 miles behind the front lines, a headquarters that engineers had spent 3 weeks constructing while combat units occupied exposed positions with no coherent defensive plan. His orders were issued in a private code so confusing that his subordinates often could not determine what he intended. Units were scattered across a wide front without mutual support. The 168th Infantry Regiment received 450 replacements just days before the German attack, many of whom had not completed basic training. When the 10th and 21st Panzer Division struck on February 14th, the result was a complete rout. American tanks were destroyed piecemeal. Infantry positions crumbled. By the time the German advance was finally halted, American casualties exceeded 6,000 men, and the prisoners who passed through German interrogation rooms seemed to confirm the pre-war assessment. These were not soldiers. These were civilians with rifles who broke and ran when serious pressure was applied. German frontline soldiers who fought at Kasserine recalled American officers losing control of their units, equipment abandoned in panicked retreats, a general atmosphere of chaos that suggested the fundamental unseriousness of the American military enterprise. Rommel noted in his papers that the tactical conduct of the American defense had been poor and that American units had shown their inexperience by losing sight of the broader picture in the chaos of battle. He was being precise rather than dismissive. Kasserine was genuinely bad. The problems Rommel identified were real. What he could not have anticipated, because nothing in his experience of European armies provided a template for it, was what American institutions did with failure. Within days of the disaster, General Dwight Eisenhower conducted a comprehensive assessment of what had gone wrong. His findings were sent back not just to units in the theater, but to training establishments across the United States, where they immediately altered the curriculum for divisions that had not yet deployed. Fredendall was quietly relieved and replaced by George Patton, who arrived at Second Corps headquarters and within 48 hours had imposed a standard of discipline, forward leadership, and combined arms coordination that his predecessor had never attempted. The Army did not court-martial Fredendall or convene a board of inquiry designed to assign blame in ways that would protect senior reputations. It identified what had gone wrong, removed the people responsible, and fixed the system. On March 23, 1943, 6 weeks after Kasserine, the 10th Panzer Division, the same formation that had led the German breakthrough, attacked near El Guettar in central Tunisia. American forces were waiting in prepared position with coordinated artillery support and anti-tank defenses that had been specifically designed to address the failures of the previous month. The Germans lost 30 tanks in 3.5 hours and retreated. The army that had panicked at Kasserine had not simply recovered. It had learned. This capacity for institutional learning was the thing that German observers consistently failed to incorporate into their analysis of American military potential. Not because the evidence was unavailable, but because it described a capability that had no clear equivalent in any army they had previously studied. The Wehrmacht's tactical excellence was the product of decades of professional development, a tradition of staff education stretching back to Moltke the Elder, and a doctrine that placed decision-making authority at the lowest possible level. These were genuinely impressive achievements, but they were also relatively static. The German army that invaded France in 1940 was brilliant in ways that had taken generations to develop, and it improved at the margins through combat experience in ways that all armies do, but its fundamental character was fixed. The American Army in 1943 and 1944 was something different. It was an organization that had been almost entirely constructed from scratch in the preceding 3 years, that was incorporating the lessons of ongoing combat into its training and doctrine with a speed that the German military bureaucracy could not match, and that was backed by an industrial base producing weapons and equipment at volumes that made the Wehrmacht's careful conservation of irreplaceable assets look, in retrospect, like a man counting his coins on a sinking ship. The production numbers that German planners had dismissed as propaganda proved to be underestimates. The United States produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1945 from 11 different manufacturing facilities. Total German tank production across all types for the entire war was roughly 26,000 vehicles. American factories built more Shermans than Germany built tanks of all kinds. The Sherman was not, by German engineering standards, the finest tank of the war. Its armor was thinner than the Panthers. Its guns struggled against the frontal armor of Tigers and Panthers at normal combat ranges. German tank crews who encountered it in single combat often destroyed it. What the Sherman possessed that German engineering standards did not measure was the ability to be built by workers who had never seen a tank before, shipped across an ocean in pieces, assembled on a beach, driven across a continent, maintained by mechanics working in muddy fields with standardized tools and standardized parts, and replaced within days of being destroyed. An American armored division that lost 20 Shermans in an afternoon's fighting had replacements arriving within the week. A German armored unit that lost 20 Panthers had lost months of production capacity that could not be recovered, because the factories in Kassel and Nuremberg were being bombed by the same aircraft that were dominating the skies over the battlefield, and because the raw materials to build replacements were increasingly difficult to obtain as Allied submarines and strategic bombing tightened the economic vies. The Foreign Military Studies program, in which American historians interviewed captured German officers after the war, produced hundreds of assessments that covered every theater and every level of command. What is striking about reading them in sequence is not the variety of their conclusions, but the consistency. Officers who had fought in North Africa, and officers who had fought on the Eastern Front, and officers who had commanded divisions in Normandy, and officers who had led battalions in the Ardennes all returned, eventually, to the same observation. The Americans could absorb losses and keep coming in a way that no European army could match, and that no amount of tactical skill on the German side could compensate for, because the arithmetic of attrition eventually overwhelmed any advantage in individual engagement outcomes. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive, and was one of the most respected German armor commanders of the war, later told the British military historian Basil Liddell Hart that the quality he had most underestimated in American forces was not their firepower or their numbers but their resilience. When you stopped them, he said, they came back. When you outmaneuvered them, they adjusted. When you destroyed a formation, another appeared. There was no point at which they accepted that they had been beaten. This observation, which Manteuffel intended as a form of professional respect, points towards something that the German generals who were most thoughtful about their defeat returned to repeatedly. The American military was not a professional army in the European sense. It was a democratic army, built in a hurry from civilians who had been told they were fighting for something that their enemies were trying to destroy. The Wehrmacht's strengths, its tactical flexibility, its small unit proficiency, its capacity for aggressive action, were the products of long professional development within a tradition that valued military virtues as ends in themselves. The American Army's strengths, its logistics, its firepower, its institutional learning, its willingness to replace inadequate leaders and try different approaches, were the products of a culture that valued solving problems over maintaining traditions. Bayerlein read the American manuals and understood the American doctrine. What he could not read was the American system. The network of factories and training camps and logistics depots and radio networks and fire direction centers and replacement pools that turned doctrine into something experienced on a July morning in Normandy as 2,500 aircraft and 4,000 tons of bombs and the complete annihilation of one of Germany's finest armored divisions. The manuals described the theory. The system delivered the fact. The documents survive. The foreign military studies are available at the National Archives. The Fort Hunt transcripts have been partially declassified. The after-action reports, the divisional histories, the captured German operational records, the post-war interrogations all tell the same story from different angles, and every angle converges on the same point. The Germans were better soldiers in almost every individual category that military professionals traditionally measured. They were outmatched by a system that did not fight by those categories. The general who read every American manual still lost. He lost because the manuals described an approach to war that was inseparable from the nation that had produced it, a nation that could build 96,000 aircraft in a single year and treat that number as a production target rather than a ceiling, that could lose a division at Kasserine and have a better one in the field 6 weeks later, that could replace every tank it lost and every pilot it lost and every artillery shell it fired before the guns had finished cooling. You can read the manual. You cannot read the factory floor.